On 31st October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1325, formally recognizing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the impact of conflict on women, and the significant role women play in conflict prevention, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Since then, 9 further resolutions have been adopted, addressing women's active and effective participation and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, popularly abbreviated as WPS, is underlined by 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. Today, 32 African countries have adopted national action plans to implement WPS. Welcome to Season 4 of the She Stands for Peace podcast, a series by the United Nations Office to the African Union, supported by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, regular listeners of the podcast will know that past seasons have been a series of interviews with key actors working to achieve WPS in Africa. In this 4th season, we depart from this format. Instead, each episode unpacks various topics aligned with the 4 pillars of WPS, with insights from guests playing critical roles in achieving the agenda. In this episode, we ask how the WPS agenda shapes the future through inclusion and participation. Participation is something guests have discussed in previous episodes. Today, women's participation across the continent remains critically low, and some countries have witnessed reversals in women's rights. This, coupled with increase in complex conflict zones in countries like Mali, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan, has raised significant concerns regarding the extent to which the inclusion of women's voices and their participation advanced UNSCR 1325, especially as we draw closer to the resolution's 25th anniversary.
In my long experience in the field, I have seen various models where women have been left out of the process.
Dr. Rabab Mohammed Ali Baldo, who is the Senior Gender Advisor to the Office of the IGAD Special Envoy on South Sudan.
They were part of the process also, and where they are silent. First, they have been left, they were not there. Second, they were there, physically there, but they were silent. And then the last model I have seen where they are there and fully engaged and fully active and influencing the outcome of the peace process, like the South Sudan peace agreement, where there is very strong gender provision, and the Darfur document also where it has very strong gender provision. And not only this, women also, they have followed it through until the implementation mechanism, because it can end up there where you have gender provision, but the implementation is another story. But in this case, in South Sudan Revitalized Peace Agreement, women were part and parcel. They represent 35% of all the implementation mechanisms, except the security-related mechanisms, like the Joint Defense Board, where all the security and transitional security arrangement decisions were made, so they were left out. And there's the issue that they don't have qualified women to be at that level, which is not true. So seeing different models, I personally agree that women being at the table mean inclusion in terms of number. If they are well prepared, capacitated, exposed, and well trained to understand the mediation process, ceasefire, and transitional security arrangement processes, and all aspects of the agreement. Because if they are physically there and they are not understanding all this and they are not well prepared, then the inclusion will not be leading us to active participation and effective participation. But if they are well prepared before putting them there, they will add the value, they will be relevant to the process. The other decision makers, the conflicting parties, they see their value of being there, and they will also engage them. An inclusive process doesn't guarantee an inclusive outcome. That is why we need to guarantee and guard against the inclusion of women and other stakeholders from being a cosmetic kind of present with ticking only the boxes. The thing to be done differently is the definition of the mediator and the evaluation of the mediator, bringing two parties, helping them to reach a consensus and get the agreement signed. So this limited definition has made some of the mediators, fast track the process to reach the agreement so that they are good mediators. And then in doing this, they miss out the importance of inclusivity and comprehensiveness to have all the stakeholders in the process.
In July 2023, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres introduced his Common Agenda and New Agenda for Peace, calling for women and youth to play central roles in policy and decision-making. Framed around principles of trust, solidarity, and universality, the new agenda has 12 proposals for action across 5 priority areas. We'll share a link to the new agenda in the show notes and the She Stands for Peace podcast page. In his remarks when presenting the new agenda, the Secretary General spoke of inclusion in the context of actions backed by inclusive political efforts for peace and fostering a forward-thinking and inclusive UN culture. Notably, though, he called on governments to take targeted steps towards women's meaningful participation and leadership in decision-making. Action 10 of the new agenda mentions support for the African Union and sub-regional peace support operations. So we asked SRSG Parfait Onanga-Anyanga, head of the UN Office to the African Union, what we must learn from previous approaches to localizing similar global agendas in African context, especially when it comes to women's participation and inclusion, and of course, how support for regional peace operations might be rethought.
Indeed, in his policy brief, the new agenda for peace, the Secretary General puts forward a very innovative and thought-provoking suggestions on ways to advance the women, peace, and security agenda. And I quote him, "We must dismantle the patriarchy and oppressive power structures which stand in the way of progress on gender equality or women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in political and public life. We governments, the United Nations, and all segments of society must fight back and take concrete action to challenge and transform gender norms, value systems, and institutional structures that perpetuate exclusion or the status quo." As you can see, Dr. Yemisi, the Secretary General is absolutely unequivocal on the need to push back wherever he sees obstacle to full gender equality. And the new agenda for peace compels us to understand and address gender inequality as a systemic and structural problem. It also reinforces the idea whereby crises are driven by misogyny, discrimination, and patriarchy. After all, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reminds us that, quote, "all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." And this, of course, applies first and foremost to women and girls. It is also clear that our current means and tools need to be adapted and updated to be effective. The Summit of the Future, slated to take place in September, will be the ideal platform for world leaders and of course, African leaders and thought leaders to come up with significant proposals towards this end. I'm particularly encouraged that this could also be an opportunity for more action for women's meaningful participation in all decision-making on peace and security, including by supporting quotas, targets, and accountability frameworks towards achieving women's equal participation. We can also do more in terms of eradicating all forms of violence against women and enact comprehensive legislation. We can advocate for action to ensure sustained, predictable, and flexible financing for gender equality. This is an area where we're not always doing well. It is a well-known fact that peace processes in which women are active participants have a 30% chance of lasting longer. I mean, this is science. It is clear that it is really in our own vested interest to ensure that women are fully involved in all peace processes. So certainly we ought to be smarter and deliberate about shifting the power differential and related obstacles that still hamper women's effective participation and leadership in peace and security initiatives. So I'm looking forward to the Summit of the Future as an opportunity to make a decisive step forward on this important agenda.
Inclusive dialogue and participations are phrases most people in the WPS world are used to hearing and advocating for. And in addition to their use in the context of women's voices, there are issues around digital transformation, sustainability both in the environmental and economic terms, and also civic participation and intergenerational dialogue through the inclusion of young people. Youth engagement means that the voices of young people, especially young women, are included when actions and decisions that inevitably impact the future are being made. It is an opportunity for them to contribute new perspectives and solutions. While this is widely recognized as essential to the WPS agenda, evidenced by initiatives like the AU's Youth for Peace program and the creation of the Office of the AU Youth Envoy in 2018, there are still gaps in the meaningful inclusion and participation of young women.
I think it would be remiss if we start off by actually not acknowledging the progress that has been made. 10, 20 years ago, we couldn't even speak of youth representation within some of our continental or regional institutions.
That's Cynthia Shingwenya, who is one of the African Union's Africa Youth Ambassador for Peace for Southern Africa.
So the first one, which is the program that I'm under, is the African Youth Ambassadors for Peace, which came about around 2018, shortly after the launching of the Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security. And one of the resolutions was that the African Union would appoint 5 young persons, one per region. I represent Southern Africa region, and I have colleagues across North, West, Central, as well as East Africa, to serve as an intermediator between the AU as a continental institution and young people that are working at the grassroots level to promote peace and security. So we're the second cohort, the first which took office during the COVID-19 pandemic and was very limited in terms of what they could achieve, as most of their engagements were virtual. So we were one of the first groups that actually did start to work physically and had a couple of engagements. And then the same applies to the Office of the Youth Envoy. But I think overall, my analysis is a step in the right direction. Of course, in terms of proportionality, we're speaking about a continent whose average population is just 18.8 years old. And we have lots and lots of young people on the continent. So I think getting to a point where representation matches the population compositions of Africa's youth, it's a long way to go. But I think where we are is a starting point. And some of the tangible outcomes of the position include, for example, in 2020, there was the adoption of the Continental Dialogue on Youth. It's called the Bujumbura Dialogue, which is the Continental Dialogue on Youth, Peace and Security that brings together young people from across sectors to discuss some of the security threats and solutions. Of course, there are other issues such as, accountability and also financing of some of these initiatives, in which I hope to see stakeholders, not just the member states of the African Union, but also external stakeholders like development partners could put more and more effort and more money into youth-led peace building and youth-led initiatives when it comes to resolving some of the challenges we find on the African continent. There is a research that was conducted, which is part of the Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security, that highlights that majority of youth-led organizations operate with less than $5,000 a year in terms of the work that they do. And yet when you look at their impact, these are not, individuals that are renting out high buildings to have offices to operate from. That's very minimal, but makes a lot of impact, especially when you look at responses to radicalization or even responses to young people that are increasingly joining extremist groups. If we were to take their peers and say to them, engage at a peer-to-peer level, the impact that they're able to make because they can relate to each other is much more than having, for instance, the traditional militaristic approaches, which we have seen as some of the responses in terms of responding to conflicts. When it comes to young women, particularly, or youth as well as young women, I think there's still stereotypes that prejudice young people and increasingly question their contributions or meaningful contributions to development as well as to politics. For example, youth are still regarded as inexperienced, regardless of the fact that they have been at the forefront of innovating some of the digital technologies that we're using that could be meaningful for development and also conflict resolution. But we find their exclusion, particularly at the national level and also on some of the development initiatives, is solely based on existing stereotypes of them being unqualified, being unwise, and I think that continues to hinder the extent to which they can meaningfully contribute to politics and development on the continent. So sometimes even us as young people, we don't see it as a responsibility to contribute to peace and security. More particularly in the region where I'm from, in Southern Africa, which has been a relatively peaceful region, have enjoyed relatively, years of peaceful existence. That we, our thinking of peace and security is sometimes we think of it as the responsibility of the state, the responsibility of security sector actors like the military and the police. So that limited awareness to actually think that I do have a role to play in my community is one of the gaps and challenges. I think economic challenges are still very glaring, and we see them impacting active citizenship. So, for example, rather than having more and more young people contribute to development issues, you'd find people are still faced with bread and butter issues. How do I find employment? How do I put food on the table? That discussing policy issues that are to the greater good of the community becomes sort of secondary. So I think economic challenges are glaring, and they affect not just young women, but also I think young people across the board. As we approach the UN resolution, or celebrating the anniversary of the UN resolution 1325, I think a more inclusive political and development architecture on the African continent. It's such a disservice that in a continent that is full of young people and particularly young women, we still don't find as many women represented in decision-making institutions. I mean, if you look at I always love looking at the photo of the Assembly of the Heads of States and Government, which just recently concluded, and you see how many heads of state, how many female heads of states do we have in the African continent? When you look at the compositions of the heads of our states and government, it's not very representative along gender lines. That doesn't paint a very hopeful picture for young women that have aspirations to get into politics. And it's not just a matter of politics and representation when it comes to issues around governance and leadership. It's actually policy design. So having women inform policies at higher levels would result in policies or initiatives that are not just gender sensitive, but gender responsive, because you're having the particular group of people affected by those decisions being represented within decision making. So I think leadership is at the center of some of the challenges we find, some of the challenges we seek to address, and ensuring that we have inclusive leadership where people are represented, not just women. I think also women from marginalized groups is also very important. And in addition to that, accountability, I think we need to be able to keep each other in check, being accountable to some of the resolutions we have put, such as Resolution 1325. It does have sort of policy frameworks or recommendations such as increased participation. We're looking at promoting women, peace and security. How do we ensure that our national governments at the national level are keeping to the terms, especially for countries that do have national action plans on women, peace and security, such as Namibia? How do we go back and say, okay, we signed this document, it was incredible, we adopted it, but are we living up to its terms? So accountability and representativeness in terms of a representative governance architecture.
Gender parity in governance is another crucial dimension in women's meaningful participation. And in episode 35 of this podcast, we spoke to editor Adiambo Ochieng about what this means in practice for young women in Kenya. Here's a recap of what she said.
Getting into politics at 30 years old in 2019 was a lesson for me after our member of parliament died. When I realized there were no women, I took my courage and got into the space, which was really difficult because it was a really patriarchal space. As a young woman, it was really challenging because from lack of support, financial support, insecurities, those were the main challenge. Campaigning as a woman, you will be insulted every day. You will be threatened every single day. And not only you as an individual who is campaigning or a candidate, but also your voter. So it means during voting time, women who are supporting you will stay at home because of the extreme threats. At the same time, as much as I experienced all these things, most of the people in my community supported my candidature and really given me their time, some of them given me their money, and I was able to hire security personnel to look after my security and also my children. Because as a young woman, you have your children and you're getting into politics, then anything can happen to your family. Politics is not a joke in African countries. And if we are talking about women, peace and security, one of the greatest pillars talks about participation. We can only involve women in policy making processes if we have a conducive environment, a friendly environment where women will sell their manifesto and work for the community after elections. But right now, it is really difficult because so many people don't understand about this resolution 1325.
You can listen to the full episode with Editor on your favorite podcasting platform or the UNOU website. But in summary, Editor spoke about issues of violence, accountability, and other experiences that form barriers to women's political participation. That's it for this first episode of Season 4 of She Stands for Peace. Next time, we will continue our focus on inclusion and participation, and this time unpacking the challenges and opportunities for amplifying women's meaningful participation in early warning systems. Until then, stand for peace with Africa's Women, Peace and Security agenda.